chapter 26. There's several of us together tonight who haven't been in on the whole journey, so let me kind of give you a quick reprise. God's first anointed king was a guy named Saul, and Saul was selected mainly because of his physique. He was head and shoulders above everybody else. He was a real strong specimen, and he did fairly well in the beginning, but as time went by, he became more and more full of himself and more likely to disobey the things that God gave him to do. And as a result, God chose another king to supplant Saul. Instead of Saul becoming a dynasty, he chose a young man named David. And of course, most of us know of King David. He becomes very famous, not just scripturally, but historically as well. And as David is growing up and becoming more and more popular, he actually goes into the service of King Saul, and the two of them get to know each other fairly well. David works as a soldier, but he also works as a musician in Saul's court to try to keep Saul controlled. Saul would have fits of anger, fits of rage, and David would come in and play for him and sing. And of course, we all are familiar with David having written a lot of psalms that are included in the Old Testament. So in the last few chapters, David has been in hiding because King Saul wants to kill him. And from time to time, the two of them will come against each other. David is unwilling to kill Saul because Saul is still God's anointed one. He's still king over Israel. But Saul is dead set to catch David and to kill David. So that's kind of where we are. Look at chapter 24 real quick. We looked a couple of weeks ago at a time when King Saul was at a cave in the region of En-Gedi. En-Gedi is a nature preserve now. There's 7 different waterfalls. It's a very pretty place, has a lot of caves. And so David and his men had been hiding out at En-Gedi. Saul found out about it and tried to get David. And in the meantime, David found Saul alone in a cave, and rather than killing him, he cut off a corner of his robe secretly, and then later on confronted Saul as to why Saul was trying to kill him. So chapter 24, verse 19, the very end of this episode, David refuses to kill Saul even though he has an opportunity. Here's what Saul says in response. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not kill off my descendants or wipe out my name from my family. So David gave his oath to Saul. Then Saul returned home, but David and his men went up to their stronghold. So he has an opportunity to kill Saul. He doesn't take advantage of that. Saul says, I realize that I was in the wrong. You're the one that's going to be king over Israel. I just ask you that you would remember my family and not do evil or do harm to my family. And so that sounds like the end of the episode, but it's not. Saul has to take care of some matters of state. He has some enemies knocking on his door. When he takes care of them, he immediately saddles back up, gets his men, and they go back looking for David again. So in chapter 26, we're going to find a very familiar sounding story. This time we're not in a cave. We're out in the open. Saul and his 3,000 troops that are kind of the elite of Saul's forces have gone out to look for David. And David knows that they're coming. He's been turned over by a group known as the Ziphites. They called Saul up and said, look, David is hiding out in our area. You ought to come and get him. So Saul has come to attack David, and David knows that he's there. Look at chapter 26, beginning in verse 5. Chapter 26, beginning in verse 5. David set out and went to the place where Saul had camped. He saw where Saul and Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of the army, had lain down. Saul was lying inside the camp with the army encamped around him. So it doesn't sound like a great place to go in and and do anything with Saul. He's surrounded by his army, by his troops, and he has his bodyguard slash general laying right there in the same campsite with him. But David then asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, who will go down into the camp with me to Saul? I'll go with you, said Abishai. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and the soldiers were lying around him. Now, for those of us who have been kind of watching this unfold, that spear has a lot of meaning. David, on two different occasions, had been playing music for Saul, and in the middle of his playing music to try to calm Saul down, Saul took that spear and tried to poke it through David into the wall. David escaped both times. A little later on, Jonathan is trying to plead David's case. Jonathan is Saul's son. He's trying to plead David's case and say he's an innocent man, you need to quit chasing him. Saul tried to pin him to the wall with that same spear. So here's this spear stuck in the ground next to Saul's head. Let's think of a couple of reasons why David should have ended the problem right there. Okay? Number one, Saul just keeps coming. Right? Saul will tell David, now I realize I'm in the wrong, you're right, I'm not going to do this anymore. And then you turn around twice and there's Saul again. He keeps saying, I'm sorry, but he doesn't change. You ever known anybody like that? I think we've all known people like that. They'll tell you they're sorry, but next time you turn around, they may be doing the exact same thing. Number two, it's easier to be righteous once than it is to be righteous twice. When he was in the cave the first time and he just cut off the corner of Saul's robe, maybe that was easier because it was it's a one in a lifetime deal. I can be good this time. He gets away, but then Saul comes back, and here he has Saul laid out in front of him. It would be easier to be righteous once than it would be to be righteous twice. And in this particular occasion, he's not going to have to do it himself. Let's keep reading. David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul, laying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and the soldiers were lying around him. And Abishai said to David, today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike him twice. I'm not sure whether he was bragging or whether he was trying to console David. I know you don't want me to strike the Lord's anointed, but I won't hit him twice. I'll only just, one time is all it's going to take. I'll just pin him to the ground and we'll be done with all of this. David, of course, is not going to allow that to happen. But you've got Saul just keeps coming. It's easier to be righteous once than it is to be righteous twice. And now he doesn't even have to do it himself. Abishai says, I'll take care of it for you. You don't have to be responsible. But David said to Abishai, verse 9, don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and remain guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, he said, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come, and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now get the spear and the water jug that are near his head, and let's go. So David gives the same response as always. This is the Lord's anointed. But he also gives a list of ways that maybe the Lord could take care of this for him. Right? Maybe it'll just be his time to die. Maybe Saul will just die of natural causes, and then I won't have to worry with him anymore. Or maybe he'll go into battle and he'll perish. Or maybe the Lord will just strike him down. Anyway, I don't have to deal with it. It's not my job to do the Lord's work. If the Lord wants him dead, then the Lord will kill him himself. Either he'll strike him down, his time will come and he'll just die, or he'll go into battle and perish that way. So he's not going to do what Abishai wants done. He's going to leave it in the Lord's hand. Reminds me of a passage from the New Testament book of Hebrews. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, That's what the Lord says. God's in charge. He's got this thing under control. So they take the spear and they take the water jug that are near his head, and they go a long way off. So verse 12, David took the spear and the water jug, and they left. No one saw or knew about it, nor did anyone wake up. Now, either Saul has horrible, horrible soldiers, or the next verse, they were all sleeping because the Lord had put them in a deep sleep. So God's going to let David do whatever David wants to do in that camp. Everybody's sound asleep. Nobody's going to wake up. Again, David makes the right decision. So David crossed over to the other side, and he stood on top of the hill some distance away, and there was a wide space between them. He called out to the army. He called out to Abner, son of Ner, "Aren't you going to answer me, Abner?" And Abner replied, "Who are you who calls out to the king?" I wanted to tell you one other thing about Abner. It's kind of interesting. In the Old Testament, and just in Hebrew in general, usually if we're talking about the son of someone, the word is bar. Like Yeshua bar Yosef, Jesus the son of Joseph. That's how people would have known him around the neighborhood. But here it's Abner. It might mean a son of the light or a father of the light in Hebrew. But it also might be an abbreviation. Sometimes his name is written in the Old Testament, Abiner, Abner. And Abner lends itself more toward he is the son of Ner. So it's repetitive. Abner, the son of Ner. He would be known by both monikers, and it's almost exactly the same thing in Hebrew. But it's kind of interesting to you and me because Abba is that term for father that gets applied to us. The Holy Spirit comes into our hearts crying out, Abba, Father. In another place, Paul says he's not given us the spirit of fear. He's given us the spirit that cries out, Abba, Father. So we are Abi God, Abi Yahweh. We are the children of the Creator God. So in our lives, this Abner is the same. And if you notice, the guy who is with David is named Abi Shai. It might very well be that his daddy's name was Shai. So anyway, just to chase a rabbit for a minute. So David calls to them from across the gorge. This also makes me think of Goliath. One of the first times we see David in action, there is this guy across the gorge, and he's crying out against Saul and against Saul's army and saying, why doesn't one of you come over here and face me one-on-one, man-to-man? If I win, the Philistines win. If you win, the Israelites win. And David takes him up on it, and he's the champion. But here's David kind of doing the same thing. He's standing across the ravine, and he's taunting Abner. Abner, where were you when I sneaked into the camp and took away Saul's spear and his water jug? Why didn't you protect your king? Why didn't you do what a good soldier is supposed to do? And of course, the answer, as we know it is, God didn't let him. God made him stay asleep while all of this was going on. So David and Saul have their usual conversation. David says, "Why do you keep trying to kill me? There's nothing that I've done against you." Saul answers back by saying, "Well, you're in the right. I'm in the wrong. I'm not the one that should be chasing you." But then David does something a little bit different. In verses 19 to 20, look over there. He complains about having been forced into exile. With Saul chasing him, he can't go home. And so he's been forced into exile. And if you remember, he's got no home to go home to. Michal has been given away. Saul gave her to another man as his wife. Now David has two other wives that he's acquired while he's been on the run. But anyway, verse 19, he says, "If the Lord has incited you against me, then maybe he would accept an offering. If, however, it's people who have done this, may they be cursed before the Lord. They have driven me today from my share in the Lord's inheritance and have said, 'Go serve other gods.' Now do not let my blood fall to the ground far from the presence of the Lord. The king of Israel has come out to look for a flea, like one hunting for a partridge in the mountains." So David says, I'm a nobody. I don't even know why you're chasing me. But if it's people who have told you that I've done something wrong to you, they're lying. And if it's God, God would accept a sacrifice. I could make amends for whatever it is you think I've done wrong, and I could come back home. But as it is, you keep chasing me, and I've had to give up my place in the inheritance among the people of Israel. He had a home place, right? Now his mom and dad have been chased out. He's got them in hiding in Moab. Who's taking care of the family farm? Who's taking care of those sheep that David watched when he was a little boy? They've run him out of his family inheritance, and he's on the road. He's running away and cannot be part of Israelite life. And you notice he says, I'm far from the presence of the Lord. When he says that, he's not talking about God being there with him or God taking care of things like keeping the enemy asleep while he's in and amongst them. He's talking about a particular place. I can't go to the tabernacle. I can't be in a place of worship with my own people because you keep chasing me. And if you kill me out here, then my blood is shed far, far from home and from my own people. So again, Saul repents, and he invites David to come back home. David returns the spear and the water jug. He has Saul send over one of his young men to get the spear and the water jug. They take that back to Saul, and Saul goes home. Right? The last couple of verses, just verse 25, the last verse in the chapter may very well have been the last conversation that Saul and David have. Now, it's not because Saul suddenly comes to his right mind and stops chasing David. There's just a lot of stuff that comes up back home, and Saul is kind of trapped into doing things he has to do at home. The Philistines are causing problems again. He's going to have to go to battle against them. He just doesn't have another opportunity. But here's the last thing that Saul says to David, as far as I know. Saul said to David, may you be blessed, David my son. You will do great things, and you will surely triumph. So David went on his way, and Saul returned home. True or false? Absolutely true. Saul is almost prophetic as he tells David goodbye. Things are going to go well for you, David. You're going to be the one that triumphs. You're going to be the one that wins in all of this. So he goes back home, and again, if you have chapter headings, you'll notice that David goes into exile among the Philistines, and the Philistines go to war against Saul and the people of Israel. So up until the time that Saul and Jonathan die and David begins his eventual rise to power, I don't think Saul and David ever spend any time talking to each other again. So this is kind of the end of that relationship. And Lord willing, we'll pick up with things that lead up to the end of Saul's life and Jonathan's life as we continue on next week. Any questions or thoughts? No? Okay. We'll leave it with you. We'll tell you guys bye.